And somewhere along the way in this process, it became crystal clear to me that one of the ways that we could participate in the life that Jesus talked about was giving up, trying to get one up on any of this, which we do. We do it by embracing we avoid getting one up on life when we embrace these things. We can't get one up on life. We embrace that life is precious. We embrace that life is short. We embrace that life has difficulties. We embrace that life is shaped by our moral choices. And because when I was doing this work, I was involved in full-time clinical practice, I knew firsthand, and because of what I'd gone through in my own analytic work, I knew I spent much of my time, and other people did, trying to avoid these things, trying to deny these things, that they applied to me. They may apply to you. I even, this is not my notes, but I even had an intense conversation with one of my very best friends who is deceased now. We were talking about death and dying. And I said to him, I said, well, if and when I die, and we don't want life to be difficult, so we try to avoid it. So my goal in my own life and in my teaching became just having ordinary life. And even back then, I was saying that my teaching was going to focus more on the gospel of Jesus than Jesus of the Gospels. Now, this is over 20 years ago, and I didn't know nearly as much then as I know now about what that meant. But I want to say two brief things about teaching about Jesus. First of all, I love doing this work. I love studying for it. I love preparing for it. I spent a portion of my morning this morning reading more about the Jesus as a historical figure. I want to know this information, and I want to share this information. And I'm using the word here, know, in the biblical sense. Adam knew Eve. It's that kind of intimate knowledge, loving knowledge of it. And second, I'm primarily wanting to reflect on, and I'm inviting you to reflect on, the universality of spiritual truths, regardless of what religion you choose to be rooted in. Got that? That's key. I think it's one of the reasons that the mission and vision statement of St. Paul's reads the way it does. Now, I'm rooting in the Jesus tradition for a wide variety of reasons. It was given to me, it's in my DNA, it's in our cultural DNA, and I'm also doing it because a distorted version of the Jesus vision is taking over our nation. And I want to contribute something of a corrective to that. So had I been born in India or Japan, I'd be rooted in an entirely different religion, and we might be talking about that. All religions are human constructions using the symbol system of the culture in which they were constructed. And if we know this, and we don't absolutize the religion that we hold, then the religion you choose can be very useful to you. It can even be fun. But it isn't necessarily the truth, okay? Let's got that. Also, way back then, in light of what I just said, I said this is not a class for the faint of heart, but for those who are willing to be involved in the journey of wholeness in living life as it is, for those who are willing to have the courage to be themselves. And if you are interested in these benefits, this could be the class for you. Now, if you're in the room early enough, pay attention to the announcement slides. And I just found out that many people watch the announcement slides online after class, right? Because if you're here early enough, if you're not, you miss some really great cartoons. And I put some energy into doing those cartoons. So go online and look at them when they'll be up on Tuesday. But if you're here early enough, one of the slides that you will read is that Ordinary Life seeks to provide an intellectually credible approach to religion and spirituality, and is open to the most current truths and insights of contemporary religious and biblical scholarship. So from the very beginning, Ordinary Life has been more about exploring than explaining. From the beginning of the teaching, I've been more interested in knowing what Jesus said and did, rather than what the church has said about what Jesus said and did. And it's interesting and fun to find this material out. So I try my best to make sure that every class I teach in here can stand on its own. But that's not possible. It's particularly going forward because these classes build. And I'm not going to go back and repeat things that were said during December. All this is online if you want to go and look at it. If you're new to the class, I would suggest maybe that you do that just to get a leg up on some of the thrust of what this particular theme is going to be about. You can go back and look. So with all of that as background, I hope that will acquaint or reacquaint you with what Ordinary Life is generally about. And now we get to those pivotal words in the lines of a work by Sarah Grant that we have used repeatedly in this class. But when I first read them, they went off like one of these Tibetan gongs that you hear, that you could hear. Sarah Grant said, "It isn't the way because Jesus walked it. Jesus walked it because it is the way." Now, my plan is to use this as a guide going forward. And I'm going to use, and when Holly and I co-teach together, we will be doing this, both of us together, a combination of 3 books. Wait till you hear the last line of this paragraph. But these books are very accessible. I think all but one of them are available. I know this is available in e-reader. This is the Gospel According to Jesus by Stephen Mitchell. Stephen Mitchell is an outstanding Middle Eastern linguistic and religious scholar. He's translated and written a number of books, and this book is incredible. And as I said, it's accessible, meaning you can read it. You don't have to have a graduate degree to understand this book. It's a book. The other book is not so accessible, meaning it's not on ebook. It is readable, but it's a little denser, but it will also be being used as a guide. And this is The Gospel in Brief by Leo Tolstoy. This is one of the 4 Gospels that have been written since our accepted Gospels written. And the other somewhat will be referring to the work of Robert Funk and the Jesus Seminar, The Gospel of Jesus. Now, this is not a Bible study class. We have those at St. Paul's, and if that's what you're interested in, you can search them out. But I'm going to use what current biblical scholarship says comes as close as possible to what Jesus actually taught. And in addition to offering spiritual teachings, I hope you will consider them relevant. I am sensitive to the line that people say they want to take something away from class. You know? I preached a sermon here one time, this is not my notes, where everybody who came to church got a fidget spinner. Because I didn't want anybody to leave saying that they didn't get anything. So, lots of fidget spinners that Sunday. I also want to contribute to religious literacy because this is where organized Protestant and Catholic religion has failed its attendees. The kind of material that I teach, and other people too, Richard Orr and other people, I'm not the only one that does this, are not taught in the general curriculum of religious education classes in church. And that in part, I think, is what has given rise to this cancer that is in our culture called Christian nationalism, that people are ignorant about it. Now, though I have just mentioned 3 books, this is the line you will not believe. It is my New Year's resolution to mention no books, or few books, not as many books. Will you settle for one a Sunday? Okay. Maybe 2. This is the way I negotiate with Sherry, maybe 3. All right. Now, there is a lot to unpack in the paragraph that I just did, so that's what the rest of the class is today. About Jesus and about purpose and about relevancy. That's where we're heading today. So, first about Jesus and what we know at the moment. Studying the Gospels in the Christian collection is hard work. And I don't expect any or many of you to do that work. That's not your job. It's not what your energy is designed for. I hope it's one of the reasons you come here. So I do that work. Trying to get a picture of Jesus and of Jesus' teachings is difficult because those who wrote about Jesus did not do it in an objective fashion. They had an agenda. They were glorifying their hero. And even more, they were glorifying one they saw as their Savior. Further, everyone, and I'm assuming this is true for everybody in this room, already has a view of Jesus. All of you have an opinion about Jesus. I don't know where you got it, don't know how it got shaped, but I know that that's true. I also know that messing with somebody's cherished view about Jesus is risky business. Most people see Jesus favorably because their Jesus agrees with their point of view. This is really important. So by that I mean most people see Jesus as agreeing with their beliefs about him and about other things. So those who wrote about Jesus didn't sit down and write a narrative. Rather, what they did was make use of bits and pieces of words and deeds that had been handed down by oral tradition for decades. And they arranged these bits and pieces to fit their purposes. We don't actually know how the Gospels were written. Scholars infer from the finished product, this must have been how this happened, and this must have been how this happened, until they go back and back and back and try to figure it out like a detective story. Another fact to keep in mind is that you don't move from the life of Jesus to something written about him. What you do is that you move from the life of Jesus to words and memories, isolated vignettes, memories that were useful to his disciples or followers in shoring up their faith and educating people who came into the movement about Jesus. Is this being clear? So these bits and pieces circulated for decades. And they often made things up. Now, I refer to this process as they wrote parables about Jesus. Just like Jesus wrote parables, his followers wrote parables about Jesus. It was a perfectly legitimate thing to do. So that, to put that another way, is that there are no sources that give us an unvarnished truth about Jesus. Because the varnished faith about Jesus covers everything. No unvarnished truth. We have varnished faith, which is okay. So, in using the material that we have, I'm going to be referring to those 3 books that I mentioned, as well as a number of others that I will not mention. But I am using the latest available scholarship that we have about Jesus. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this is going to involve, for a lot of people, a lot of unlearning. Then you go back and read about that. I'm still learning. I'm 87. I'm still learning. And it's so exciting for me to still learn. And there's more to learn. And that's exciting and hopeful. So it's just one of the more exciting features about what I do as a spiritual teacher. Okay. Second, this leads me to saying in the second place, I doubt that any of you who attend Ordinary Life are here because you're looking for a graduate seminar on Jesus or his teachings or writings. You and I as well want knowledge and information that will lead to our personal transformation, things that will be useful for us. And our context is not the same context as first century Palestine. Our context is not Jewish. We are not Jewish. Our context is that we do not live in a country ruled by an occupying power yet. But speaking with awareness of that context and speaking to and out of this context is a real challenge to make that translation. Now, the discipline of theology is meant ultimately to provide useful information for leading a life in line with the religion that theology espouses to teach. So in this case, we are in line of a Judeo-Christian tradition. And as you are aware, there is a vast divergency of opinion about religious and spiritual truth. There are people on the far right, on the right and far left. This is to my left, but to your right. And let's be aware that nationally and globally, we're shifting politically and religiously in this direction. This is our context. So that today, those of us who may call ourselves progressive are in the center. To the left is a theology that most of us are not well familiar with, but we will get better acquainted in the months ahead, is a form of theology and psychology called liberation theology, and that's more to the left. So if you're a progressive and you thought that you were on the cutting edge, you're in the middle today. And on the right are the fundamentalist conservatives, and on the left are the liberation theologians. Now I'm going to give you a quick illustration of how these theologies differ and I'll relate it to the birth narratives that we have just been through. We began walking the Wayless Way during Advent because I wanted to connect the beginning of the journey with the beginning of the Jesus story. And I think it's important to know, because the birth narratives are announcements about what is to come in the story, and I think they prepare us for the teachings that are going to come given the context we are about to live through. So let's take one example, given the three modes of theology that I just mentioned. Okay, let's take the virgin birth. On the right, in the virgin birth, the conservative to fundamental level, the virgin birth is considered a literal fact. A woman got pregnant without benefit of sexual intercourse. She had a baby, and that baby became the Son of God. That is so critical to conservative fundamental beliefs that it's one of the 6 fundamentals. Jesus was literally born of a virgin, and if you don't believe that, you're not part of that group. Now, in a few weeks, when we get to an understanding of the doctrine of creation, I want to show what a distorted view of creation that is. But just hang on to that in the middle. For progressives, most here, the virgin birth is seen as a myth, mythological in nature. It's a parable. Since most cultures at that time, meaning Greek and Roman that we know about, virgin births were common in Greek and Roman societies. There was nothing surprising when they created a story that said that Jesus was born of a virgin. Okay, we believe that. But they didn't take it literally in the way that we think of literal. That didn't happen for a long time. It was just okay. So if you'd gone to somebody who went to the temple of Minerva and said, why don't you come to my Christian gathering because our Savior was born of a virgin, they would say, so? I don't think so. The temple has better coffee than you do. So they wouldn't be interested in it. That's for us. And most of us would probably be in that. To the left, in liberation theology, all of a sudden the virgin birth becomes much, much more important. Not that the people on the left consider it as a liberal thing, but the fact that so many young unmarried women get pregnant and have to be adored in that culture makes sense that is the avenue through which God comes into the world. And so if you go to Africa, if you go to Latin America, if you go to South America, you're going to see the Virgin Mary held up in much of an idolized way. And this has been going on for a long time. This is liberation theology, which is not new except to us, to most of us. Am I making sense? I think that's fun to know. So if you pay attention to the teachings of Jesus, he was a liberation theologian because he didn't speak to people mostly like us. He spoke to people on the bottom and in the edges. Liberation theology does that, and an increasing number of our world population live right there. Okay. It's hard for people who are affluent, who are looking forward to watching the Chiefs this afternoon at 3:30, or the Texans at noon today. It's hard for us to get in mind that, if you're paying $150 for a football ticket. When we went to see Conclave, 2 old people went to see Conclave, senior tickets, 1 popcorn, 1 water, and parking, $70. That's not unaffluent. Okay. So we talked about context, and relevance, talked about Jesus, and now let's talk about relevance. So what do we mean when we say that we want spiritual and religious teachings that we hear to be relevant? I think people following the path of explanation are looking for things that will support their already held beliefs. People who come at life from the explanation position, whether that's political or religious, will frequently say things like, well, the simple truth is, or the fact is, and then they will state their position. Conservative theology has, in the extreme, 6 things. You believe them, that's it. Simple, plain, clear cut. That's it. People who come at life from the exploration position know that there's no simple truth. Or they know that no truth is so simple, right? I can stand right here and look back to teachings that I did in this spot 10 years ago with embarrassment. I believed that then. I said it. It's on paper or it's in the cloud. I thought I understood it. Now that gives me reason to believe that what I'm even saying right now will be relative 10 years from now. People on the right don't hold that position. The Word of God is unassailable. God never changes. The truth is what it is, always has been, always will be, settled. I had a spiritual director when I came to Houston, a man that I love dearly, still love. He died in the 90s, but I just thought he was just so wonderful, and he taught me so much. And I remember one day when sitting in his presence, I was struggling with something that he was trying to get me to see about how difficult, or if not impossible, to answer some of the questions that I had put to him were. And he had said something about a truth, and it finally dawned on me. And he could tell by the way my facial expression changed that I'd gotten it, you know. And he looked at me, and his timing was just perfect. And he said, see, simple truth is not so simple. That's the title of this class, by the way. So when I pick up a book or I go hear a speaker, there are 3 things that I'm looking for to evaluate whether that time was a waste of my energy or not. First of all, does the teacher I am reading or hearing believe what they're saying? Is it true for the teacher? If it's not, and for a lot of people, it isn't. I had a conversation with Dr. Jeff McDonald, our senior pastor here earlier last year, and we were talking about AI, and I was telling him some of the things that I was just on the front edge of discovering about AI, and he said, oh yeah, there are an increasing number of clergy who ask AI to write their sermons. And you can do that. There's an app that you can buy for your device. I think you rent it I just canceled mine. I did it as an experiment. It's about $12 a month that you can say to AI, I am not making this up, folks. You can say to AI, I need an 18-minute homily written for this demographic with 2 jokes on this passage of Scripture, and it will give it to you in less than a minute. And Jeff said a lot of clergy are doing that. I would hate that. Because to me, the joy of teaching comes from the learning and preparation of writing a class and getting it done. But to stand and just read some prepared material, I don't want to do that. But it's done. There's a huge difference for me. I've had those days when I would go from here to think, oh, gee, I've got to teach again next Sunday. There's a difference between that feeling and leaving here, which I already have for next week, saying, I get to teach next Sunday. Those are different. There's a different dynamic, and it communicates. Emotional mode, I believe, communicates. If the speaker doesn't believe it, you can pick it up. Like a dog. Dogs know. Right? I think cats do too. They just don't care. So does it matter to the speaker? Second, is it true? And third, so what? What does it matter? Does it matter to me? Relevance for those on the explaining path means they find it agreeable. Relevance for those on the exploration path means, wow, or It can mean that initially, I'm sure. Might not be appetizing. So the birth narratives are important because they are miniature versions. They're summaries of what's going to follow in the narrative. Matthew was written, and then the birth narrative was created. Luke was written or assembled, and then the birth narrative was created. If you read Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2, you have a summary of everything that's going to come. So Jesus was born into a part of the world that was known at the time for its peace, the peace of Rome, Pax Romana. But it was a peace that was sustained and maintained through brutal victory and violence. So when you read in the Gospels that they're talking about the end of the world, it doesn't mean something's going to happen out there someday. They meant the end of the regime under which they were living at the time and their transformation because of the end of that regime. That would be the end of the world for them. Okay. It didn't mean the destruction of the earth. Now, these are the things I think that our culture is in great need of. For example, when you read the very boring genealogies in Matthew or Luke, they're not about history. They're not about accuracy. They are advertisements of what's to come. Central to the birth story is the celebration of light and darkness. And relevant to our current theme about walking the wayless way is a line from the Psalms that every initial story hearer of these stories would have gotten because they're Jewish. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them the light has shined. That's from Psalms. They would sing it. They would know it. We're not so well acquainted. So this has both a very personal meaning and a very political meaning. And it's important to see both. Now, these writings were not written with us in mind because they were constructed to speak to the personal needs and yearnings of ancient people. But they do address our personal hopes and our politics as well. Now, as far as we know, every religion throughout human history, as far as we know, has had a theology about its religion. That is, every religion has had a set of rules about its rituals and beliefs. Theology means words, or God words, theologos, words about God. Every religion has had some theology about rules and rituals and beliefs. And every one of these theologies has in some way been political. And that's certainly true for the religion of Jesus and Judaism. Now, in our culture, there's a pretense that religion and politics don't mix. Horse feathers. For many people in our culture, their political positions and beliefs are held more dearly than their religious beliefs. So one of the most important theologians of our time, I didn't do it, has said quite accurately, tell me how you think and act politically, and I will tell you what God you believe in. So one of the things that we do for exercise is that when the weather permits, we go for a walk. We walk the neighborhood. We walk. I know you walk. It's a great thing. We walk to Herman Park. We walked all the way to the zoo the other day. You know how expensive it is to go to the zoo in Houston? It's a lot of money. And then lately the weather is perfect for walking. And the other day we were in the middle of an hour-long walk when I stopped and said, can you believe it? Here we are walking in 76-degree weather, and it's the 29th of December. And I said, I suppose the change is the new normal. I have mixed feelings about this guy, H.L. Mencken. I collected quotes of his for years. I got a special folder of quotes of H.L. Mencken. He was a journalist and a critic. He could capture things so well. He is the one who said, for every complex problem, there's an answer that is simple, clear, and wrong. He also wrote this. As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be occupied by a downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron. He wrote that in 1920. Erosion happens slowly. Like the frog in the pot of water where the temperature is slowly increased, unnoticed by the frog until fatality. So the result of the recent election, that's our new normal. I have heard, as of you, a gazillion theories why the election turned out the way it did. And many, like Monday morning quarterbacks, are so sure their analysis of the game is correct and how it was won or lost. I don't think anybody knows. I do know that we endured a cycle of campaigning in which hatred, lying, and out loud racism were assault weapons. And whatever had been political correctness has been replaced by something else. The election that we just went through, no matter which side you were pulling for, was a dark time. So what's next? We don't know. But while we were walking, what made me stop and make that comment was comparing the weather with how things used to be. It used to be that kids put on warm clothes for Halloween. Not now. Used to be Jimmy Carter was our president. And so he died. His funeral is going to be this week. And no doubt you've seen many of the comments and commentaries about him. His character is quite a contrast from our incoming president. I don't know what lies ahead, but I do know that an edifice built on misogyny, racism, and homophobia, nationalism, portends a dark time. And I do also believe that over the long time, that edifice will not be able to stand. But in the meantime, you know, the Bible is a very political document. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons I want to teach about biblical literacy is that most people don't know the Bible. As I said, knowing Jesus' narrative and doing hard work is hard work. And for many people, especially those in the Christian nationalist movement, the Bible is like a hot dog. They have no idea what's in it. They just eat it. One of the most valuable print publications I take is a document called The Christian Century. Yes, it's an awful title, I agree. But it's been in publication since 1884, and it was on the front end of that controversy that I've mentioned to you a number of times that broke out in the Northeast at Princeton about the fundamentalist and the modernist. This publication was on the front end of that, declaring that there would be a new era. It would be the Christian century. Now, most people just refer to it as the century. Hermes and Fosdick was leader in that movement. One of the founding editors of the Christian century was a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr, who is the guy who wrote the Serenity Prayer, which you might want to add to your daily spiritual practice for the days to come. It's good. The Christian Century is the first publication that published in its entirety Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. It's cutting edge, out there kind of stuff. It used to be published once a week, then twice a month, and now once a month. And their mission statement, maybe we could adopt their mission statement since we don't have one. It's thinking critically, living faithfully. I like that. So, by the way, you can go to their website and subscribe to the Christian Century for $60 a year. Not everything will be relevant to you, but it's got some really good stuff in it. So, in the December issue, they had an article about this guy, Gabor Ivanyi, however you say his name. Who? Ivanyi. Thank you. You know who he is? You ever heard of him? I hadn't either. He's a Methodist preacher in Hungary. He made the news. You want to see the headline that went with the story? The headline was, "The Most Dangerous Preacher in Hungary." Methodist leader Gabor Smith is perhaps Viktor Orban's fiercest critic. And he is looking to Americans for solidarity. This is a news story. Didn't make our papers. This article is so important on every level. As I indicated, the globe seems to be gravitating or acquiescing or coming under more and more authoritarian rule. Viktor Orban is one of Donald Trump's heroes, just to be aware. So, having said that, I also want to say that finding a way to speak politically without sounding partisan is hard. I don't think it is my goal to offend anybody or to alienate anyone. But as I said, there are many people who are touchier about their political stuff than they are any religious doctrine they hold to. I don't think it is partisan to say that our incoming president is an indicted felon. It's a fact. For sexual stuff, twice. And it's pretty clear he's a pathological liar. Now, I don't know, because I don't know people's hearts and minds, whether people who support authoritarian regimes, for such people, character doesn't matter, or whether, as one of my dear friends who's a Trump supporter said to me, his policies are more important to me than his character. Whatever. I understand that. I don't agree with it, but I get it. He ain't no Jimmy Carter. And this is the reason I think this story about this Methodist preacher is so important. Because here's a guy taking a stand publicly in a place where it's unsafe to do so about something that really matters. He's taking a stand, not a political stand, but a spiritual stand that is political. In one of the birth narratives, Herod has all the male children in Bethlehem slaughtered. That's a parable. It never happened historically. But it's a parable about the fact that the baby Jesus will grow up and go into a world that will crucify him. But the story doesn't end there. It doesn't end with political power and violence. In the very beginning of the story, there are signs and symbols of those who will come to love him. Kings who pay homage to him, shepherds who visit him, angels who sing in the sky of peace on earth and joy to the world, a star that shines in the darkness that the darkness cannot overcome. So after the birth, what happens to the so-called, as we call them, the Holy Family? What happens to them? They have to flee to Egypt. Didn't happen, but it's a parable. They become refugees. This connects to our culture, where millions of people in the world are fleeing terror and violence. The news reports calls them immigrants in a disparaging way. They're escapees. Herod, in multiple modern guises, is still insidiously at work. And our work is to join with people like this guy in following the wayless way. We can strive to be Jimmy Carter's in the Donald Trump world. And in talking with a friend of mine about what I was preparing to say for today, I told him I was going to use that line. And he said it sounded like a version of Romans 12:2, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I'm such a smart aleck. I'm sorry. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable." Or as Eugene Peterson translates it, don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit in without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You will be changed from the inside out. Archbishop Oscar Romero, a 20th century Christian martyr killed by the powers that be in El Salvador, once said that we're called to be Easter Christians in a Good Friday world. That is, in a world still ruled by Herod and Caesar. So also we are called to be Christmas Christians in a world that descends into darkness. But that descent doesn't have to have the final word unless we let it. Choosing to walk the wayless way is choosing to walk a way that is contrary to our culture, but it is a way of spiritual freedom, spiritual light, and spiritual life. I invite you to join me on it. See you here next week. Thank you.